All right. Let's see if this is all working. We're just going to take the next minute here and see if everything's working. If it is, then we will get going. And if it's not working, then we will not get going. That's kind of how I think about it. Let's see. Are we going? Are we technically going? Let's see. Let's refresh this. Let's go here. Let's go here. We're going to go here. We're going to go here. I think it's going to be good. Let's see. I think so. I think we're good. All right. I'm just going to share this real quick, on Twitter, and then we're off to the races, wherever the races actually specifically are. Okay. Here we go. I'm going to get rid of that and go here. We're going to copy the link. We're going to go here. We're going to go here. Here we go. Oh, Jonathan Cogburn is here. Heck yes, it's going to be one of those episodes. Look at that. All right. It's going to be fun. I'm just going to share this real quick on Twitter, and then we're going to get after it, as they say. Almost there. Okay. Okie dokie. Almost there, almost there. One more quick post, and here we go. All right. Well, hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, whoever you are, wherever you are. I'm Dr. Patrick Lockwood, and this is UnShrink Me. For the purpose of this podcast and all of my podcasts, I'm just Patrick because I don't want to get sued or lose my license or anything. However, much of what we talk about, much of what I talk about, much of what we discuss back and forth in the chat is focused on, clinical psychology, psychiatry. And so if you're brand new, please know that the spirit of UnShrink Me, this podcast, is both collaborative and critical. So the goal, genuinely, is to create an information base with all of these episodes that if you were to watch all of them, you would have a well-rounded perspective on what exactly clinical psychology and psychiatry is about. What is the goal? What's helpful? What's not helpful? And people share their experiences in the chat. People share anecdotes. Some of them are professionals, so they share what they do and what they expect. Something else that this podcast is about is criticizing the profession, not criticizing individuals, but criticizing the profession, because the profession does harm people, sometimes unintentionally and sometimes out of negligence. And those are different things. And so I'd like to be able to steer people away from potential harms if it's possible, because very few people in the profession actually speak openly about what's wrong with the profession. And so this is an openly collaborative and critical podcast that is dedicated to you, the consumer. So if you or someone you know, someone you love, needs therapy, is getting therapy, treatment, rehab, or whatever it is, this podcast is for you. Because I want you to be as informed as possible so you can make the best possible decisions. This is not advice specifically for you or anyone you know. This is just general critique and commentary on the profession. So please, if you need specific medical advice, specific psychological advice, therapy advice, etc., please find a qualified professional. And if you need help finding that person, you can hit me up on Twitter and I will do my best to help you. My handle on Twitter, by help you, I mean not do therapy with you, but to direct you in the, direction of some professional in your area that can help you find a referral. So my handle on Twitter, if you want to find me and seek out comment, critique, derision, or help or referrals, my handle is at Alobha Patrick, ALOBHA So Alobha means non-attachment. Okay, so today's episode is a special one because although I missed last week and things were going on, busy recording things and all this stuff, I had some planned topics, but because of some recent conversation with my friends on Twitter, it's really important to highlight these topics as opposed to the planned topics. So hopefully, if all goes well, next week I'll get to my planned topics for this week. We'll see. So this week, today, I'd like to talk about trauma, victimhood, victim mentality, and then I'll talk about clinical training for another chunk of this podcast. So first and foremost, let's get our terms perfectly clear. And let me explain the rationale for discussing this. So earlier today, one of the people that I'm, I guess, friendly with on Twitter is this, I think, critical of psychiatry, critical of mental health person named Nick Tabor at NickTaber. And Nick is an interesting cat for sure. Jonathan says, we love some loving derision. Absolutely. It doesn't hurt anybody if it's friendly, for sure. Friends should give each other shit. So Nick, and by the way, this podcast is not NOT sponsored by Celsius, but this is great stuff. So anyways, I was talking with Nick Tabor earlier today on Twitter, and Nick and I are friends, frenemies, I don't know what, but we are both people who are trying to do similar things from different perspectives. So I think Nick is someone who has openly discussed the fact that he was hurt by the industry, and I am someone who is in the industry trying to reform the industry as a grad psych professor, as a clinical supervisor, as a consultant. So my explicit mission is to reform and rehab the rehab industry, essentially. And so Nick was talking earlier today about many things that are relevant for today's podcast. But the first thing that really came up in a series of back and forths is the discussion around trauma and victim and healing and victim mentality and victimhood, because these are all very trendy words. And so I want everyone to hear me very loud and clearly. This is my preamble for the conversation. Very, very loud and clear. What I'm about to say is very complicated. And so it may or may not apply to you. It may or may not offend you. It may or may not bother you or confuse you. And I don't have a particular perspective on you as an individual because I don't know you. So nothing I'm about to say is specific to you and your situation. So if you do happen to be offended or take something I say personally, that's something worth discussing, perhaps with a friend, a family member, or a professional if you have one. So I want to talk about all these terms first and foremost and not waste time on definitions per se, but I really want to talk about what good therapists are supposed to be doing, what ethical therapists are supposed to be doing when it comes to trauma, having been victimized, past tense, and then victim mentality, which is more of a present tense experience. So first and foremost, let's talk about trauma. Now, many times this word comes up and there's all sorts of definitions from all sorts of famous authors like Judith Herman, or there's the DSM-5 version of trauma, DSM-5 TR, or there's some other paper you like. There's Bacigalupi from Italy. There's all these people who talk about trauma, and I am not going to sit here and give you the most comprehensive definition. I'm going to give you a quick and dirty, practical definition most clinicians could use. So most of us generally look at trauma as a reaction, not an event, number one. So most of the time in clinical training, in clinical psychology and psychiatry, we do not look at trauma as an event. So like being assaulted, being molested, being in a bad car accident, having your life threatened. These are events. Now the DSM-5 TR, typically these events are considered trauma. But most clinicians nowadays consider trauma a reaction to an event like that, right? And so if I were to pick 4 criteria, and these are broad, so forgive me for being broad because I know certain people have different definitions that they like, and so I'm not meaning to cover all definitions. That's not what this podcast is about. There's plenty of cool papers out there that look at all the definitions and why they exist and why they're good and bad and all that stuff. The purpose of this podcast is just nuts and bolts. What's a simple, understandable definition? So trauma generally has essentially 4 criteria, right? So criteria number 1 generally is feeling overwhelmed, which goes along concurrently with criteria number 2, which is you're overwhelmed beyond your current resources to overcome or manage your overwhelm, right? So you feel like you're stretched beyond your natural resources to tolerate being overwhelmed. So that's 1 and 2. Being overwhelmed, number 1. Number 2, past your current resources. Number 3, to the point where you believe that you might die, right? You might die. You feel so helpless, for instance, if you want to use a psychological word, that you might die, right? And number 4, such that 1, 2, and 3, such that number 4. 1, 2, and 3, such that number 4. You feel so overwhelmed and stretched beyond your resources, such that you might die, and an essential worldview, an essential piece of yourself is shattered, right? So those 4 things, I believe, are a general framework for what we might call trauma, right? And that's a reaction, which means it's subjective, because all of us human beings are built differently. All of us react differently to different stimuli. Maybe I can get in a car accident and I wouldn't react with all 4 of those criteria, where I feel overwhelmed to the point that I feel helpless, that I might die, and that I might actually shatter some sense of self, safety, security, goodness, whatever it is, right? Whereas you, the random person here, might actually experience that car accident in a traumatic way. You might react such that, right? So trauma is not just being overwhelmed. Trauma is not just thinking you might die. Trauma is not just the shattering of something you belief that you hold dear, right? So trauma is all 4 of those things put together. So I hope that definition makes sense. So that's definition 1, what is trauma? Definition 2, so someone on Twitter was asking me earlier today, what does it mean to be a victim? Because we were talking about trauma, victim, and victim mentality, etc. So what does it mean to be a victim? Well, this is not something that is in the psychological literature. There is no clinical psychology like specific definition of being a victim, right? There are political definitions, there are legal definitions, all these things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Merriam-Webster, because I am not some magical thesaurus or dictionary. So essentially, just for context, the word victim, at least per Merriam-Webster, is from the original Latin victima or victima, because I believe the V is a W in Latin, victima from the 15th century. And so the original version of the word victim, in original Latin at least, meant specifically, per Merriam-Webster, if they're correct, a living being sacrificed to a deity or in the performance of a religious rite, right? So in history, at least, when people, at least in the West and Europe, etc., used the word victim, they meant someone who is being sacrificed to a larger, more powerful force, right? Specifically a deity, so it was more of a religious ritual kind of thing. However, you can see how the original definition morphs into the more like vague version, which is definition number 1, which is one that is acted on and usually adversely affected by a force or agent. Now, what's missing from number 1 compared to the original definition on Merriam-Webster is that the agent that is harming them in the original definition is some higher order being, right? So we are sacrificing a person to God, right? We are sacrificing an animal or whatever it is, right? So we're doing something, we're giving up something for the sake of a higher good, which has completely disappeared from the commonplace definition, which is, again, from Merriam-Webster specifically, as of today, one that is acted on and usually adversely affected by a force or agent. So if your life is made worse in some way by some outside force, that's what being a victim is. So that is exactly how I would describe being a victim. Now, others of you who are watching or listening might use a different definition. Maybe you'd use a political definition. Maybe you'd use a sociological definition. I'm open to pretty much any definition because as a clinical psychologist, our job is not to define who is and who is not a victim. We are not interested in that because ethically speaking, we can't make that determination of if you felt adversely affected by an outside force. I cannot tell you as a clinical psychologist. It is unethical for me to tell you, just so everyone's clear, it is unethical for me to tell you, no, you shouldn't have had that reaction. That's not my job. My job is not to tell you if you feel like you were victimized. It's not my job ever. As an ethical psychologist, my job is literally always to try to help people understand themselves and help them feel understood to the extent that I can humanly do that as an outsider to their experience. And then also, my job is to help them feel empowered to do something with that sense of being victimized. So it is not my job to define what it is to be a victim as a clinical psychologist. My job as a clinician is not to tell you whether or not you've been victimized. I'm not here to define it for you. That is something for you to define, because I cannot know what is happening inside of you with 100% certainty, which means that I can never make a formal declaration that you were victimized. I can take you at your word. We can explore what you're saying and feeling, but that's not the same thing as me declaring as an authority that yes, you were victimized. So I hope that makes sense to everyone. I'm trying to say it over and over again, so there's no way I can be misinterpreted with the next thing I'm about to say. So I'm trying to set up an order of events so that the next thing I'm about to say makes perfect sense as well, even though the next thing I'm about to say might be on the more scandalous side of things for some people. But before I get to that next thing, let's go back to the comments. Jonathan says, the person's agency is relinquished or perhaps taken from them in service to an external entity. Yes, exactly. That's what they describe as being a victim generally. It is an interesting history for sure. All right. So far in this podcast, I've had a 4-part definition of trauma. I've defined per Merriam-Webster what it means to be a victim to something, right? So they have the ancient definition from the 15th century, sacrifice to a religious deity, and the modern definition, which is more vague, which is to be adversely affected by an outside force. Okay. So that's very vague. It's very, very vague. It's as vague as possible. And so I'm happy to use that definition. I don't have any problem with that definition. So the next thing I'm about to say is what might be seen as political or culture war, scandalous or conservative, whatever, and I'm none of those things. I'm kind of scandalous, but not anything else. So there's a difference between having been victimized, past perfect tense, versus being a victim, present tense, which being is a gerund. So being a victim, like right now, I'm acting as a victim or enacting, inhabiting the role of victim right now. I am a victim versus having been victimized. Okay. And this is where being a clinician gets tricky, because there is no perfect way of separating this out. So what I'm about to say is complicated. And I want everyone to hear me say how complicated this is. Okay. Because this is not some political culture war, pull yourself up by your bootstraps crap. Okay. This is how hard is it to be a person when you've experienced trauma or you've been victimized. Okay. So if we take the idea of being adversely affected by an external agent as being a victim, right? You've been hurt by an external thing. Then in reality, all of us are victims all day, because all of us are actively being hurt by all sorts of things. So I'm just going to create a really ridiculous list of things, which I believe are all technically true. So for instance, those of us that live in big cities like myself, I'm here in LA, we're all being victimized. We're being hurt by each other's carbon and smog and bullshit. We're being hurt by kind of like toxic conversations that are at the coffee shop and at the gym. And, you know, we're hurt by all the negative nastiness online. You know, hey, Phil, good to see you here. We're also hurt by like the crap that's in our water. We're victims to all the things that are happening in our water. There's toxic stuff. There's Flint, Michigan water. There's all these things, right? So like, if you want to be literal about being a victim, which is being hurt or adversely affected by external forces or agents, all of us at every given day, at every given moment, are being adversely affected probably by at least a series of external forces, whether it's pollution, whether it's crappy food additives, you know, toxins, or people, right? So pretty much all day, all of us are at least capable of being bombarded by tiny, tiny forces that all add up. So we're being bombarded by crappy conversation in the background where people are nasty and mean to each other. We're bombarded by toxins in our food, in our water. We're bombarded by pollution and smog. We're bombarded by lots of little things. So technically, in a literal sense, and this is not to demean other types of being a victim, this is just one frame of reference. In one frame of reference, most people in most societies are capable of being seen as victims because they are adversely affected, to use that super general definition from Merriam-Webster, at any given time. Because we're being hurt by the greed and corruption of companies that pollute our air, by the selfishness of other human beings who put pollution because of their cars in our face, right? Sitting on the 101 here in LA, sitting on the highway, right? So in reality, it's true that one version of being a victim, just one, not the only, not the most important, just one version of being a victim is to be adversely affected by the forces outside of yourself, which means literally every day you get in a fight with your wife or your friend or your boss, or people treat you poorly online, or your coworkers are nasty to you, or there's pollution or smog or toxic food or toxic water or whatever it is, you're technically a victim to all those forces. In some people's cases, all day, every day. And we actually have interesting research on how stressful that is for developing immune systems in kids that grow up in impoverished areas where they are poisoned and full of noise and toxins and light and all this stuff. So I think it's a real thing. I'm not trying to use it as a ridiculous counterexample. I actually think it's a real thing for sure. So that's version one of being a victim. And most people are victims on a regular basis then. But then when we come to the discourse on Twitter, there's a special version of being a victim that I think people talk about that I think is really worth unpacking for a second. Okay? So this other version of being a victim is to be especially adversely affected. So I'm going to add an adjective or adverb or something in there. I'm going to add the adverb especially, right? To be especially adversely affected, aka stressed out, traumatized, marginalized, oppressed, right? That's a different version. It's like a level up of being adversely affected when you're oppressed or traumatized or something like that, if that makes sense. So when you're especially victimized, like traumatized or molested or assaulted or stabbed or whatever the bad thing is, all of which are real and they happen all the time, unfortunately. So that version of being a victim is different than the, let's call it more commonplace version of being a victim, which is exposed to nasty chatter online, nasty friends, toxic exes, pollutants, all this stuff, right? So level one, level two, if you want to think of it that way. I don't know that that's a good way to think about it. It's just off the cuff. So if this next level up of being a victim is, you were badly traumatized maybe once and victimized in that regard, then maybe that is especially difficult to tolerate and process. Excuse me. And so the problem that I face is when people talk about themselves as being a victim, I think it's so interesting that people from the level 2 category who've been through an obviously probably difficult circumstance where they probably experienced it as traumatically, like being assaulted, molested, and things like that, they see themselves as a victim often because they were victimized, right? Whereas the people who are being, destroyed by the federal government, the people who are, experiencing toxic water every day, the people who are experiencing toxic smog every day, probably don't see themselves as victims in the same way as someone who was just assaulted or someone who's been molested, for instance. And so it's interesting that both, the very vague Merriam-Webster definition applies to both categories of people, but category B, the ones, or level 2 in this framework, absolutely identify with the concept of being a victim. And then there's a special version of this, which is the people who continue to see themselves as a victim despite the fact that they have agency and even power over the people, places, and things that have oppressed them or hurt them. That is different. So that's a different category, right? And so when I talk about, and I think when conservatives talk about this too, I think there's a specific reason. They have a different goal than I do, but I think unfortunately we use similar vernacular, so it's easy to get them confused. So there's a difference between currently being a victim, which pretty much all of us are to some degree in some sense, versus having been victimized on the other hand. And so is it possible for most of us to be a victim or to have been victimized? Absolutely. Most of us have been taken advantage of in our lives and adversely affected. Many people I know have been assaulted. Many people I know have been in tragic car accidents because of ignorance and selfishness of another driver. Many people I know have been abused by siblings or parents. Many people I know, because I do clinical work, right, have been assaulted or molested. Many people I know have been involved in scams of some kind, right? So I personally and professionally know so many people who have been victimized in the level 2 sense. They've been oppressed by the government, oppressed by a family member, intimate partner violence, molestation, physical assault, sexual assault. I've seen it all in my career, and it's always bad, and it's never okay. Then there's this really complicated problem we all have, which is, what is the most adaptive way to look at ourselves currently, all things considered? Now, obviously, all things considered is a rather complicatedly large list of things. It's all things. So the question that we always have to ask ourselves when we do therapy with people who have been through serious trauma, whose lives have been threatened, whose sense of bodily integrity has been broken, whose sense of moral integrity has been broken, whose sense of, safety and certainty in the world has been broken, shattered. That's number 4 in my definition of PTSD or trauma, right? So like when your worldview or self-concept has been shattered by something, how does one see yourself as complete, as whole, as unbroken, as inherently okay when you have experienced these horrific experiences? That's a tough question to answer, which is always unique to the person. So I'm not sitting here in some high moral authority place saying, I know exactly how you should see yourself. And I do not, repeat, want it to come off that way. And the reason is because it's impossible for me to know, as an outsider to your experience, how you should see yourself. I cannot sit here objectively with all the knowledge in the world, with all the training in the world of whatever modalities. I cannot perfectly know who you are supposed to be. It's impossible for me to know. I'm not God or something, so I can't know that. What I can know is what you tell me. What I can't observe are patterns of your behavior, right? And I'll get to this when we talk about clinical training here in a minute. But so what I can know for sure is what you've said to me. What I can know for sure is how you react to me. What I can observe are patterns of behavior, either between us or from the outside when you tell me stories about your life, right? And so using just those 3 data points, I can make a determination as a clinician about how useful this current mentality, this current headspace, this current attitude, this mindset is for you based upon what you tell me, right? I can't tell you authoritatively that you should think like this at all times, no matter what. It's impossible. But on a moment-to-moment, session-to-session basis, we can have a conversation where hopefully we tell each other the truth and we're transparent about emotions and experiences and needs and goals. And we can collaboratively figure out together, emphasis on the word collaboratively, if this current attitude you have is actually helping you or not. So I hope everyone heard exactly what I just said as clearly as possible, because the next thing I'm about to say is going to sound like a talking point from the culture wars, but it's literally not, and it can't be. Okay? So as a clinician, in all of my years in, the rehab industry, Rehabistan, as I call it, but even in private practice settings and family therapy settings, I've worked with all kinds of people from all backgrounds. I've worked with, people with very low IQ, very high IQ, people who are rich as hell, and people who are broke and homeless. I've worked with pretty much every kind of person so far in my career. And in my career so far, here is what I have noticed. This is just me observing from my sample, the convenient sample of my clinical career and from my supervisees, the programs I've worked at. So it's like, let's call it a convenient sample of like a dozen clinicians, myself, my supervisees, my grad students, etc. Like, it's not a giant sample of thousands of professionals. This is just a tiny sample of my convenient sample of life for the last 20 years. Here's what I've noticed. Okay? What I've noticed very simply is the people that find a way, I'm going to say this again, the people that find a way to not see themselves as a victim are the ones that tend to function better in life. It's very simple. The people that find a way to not see themselves as a victim are the ones that tend to function better in life. So, that might be a controversial statement. It's not meant to be. It's just my experience as a clinician, as a supervisor, as a consultant, as a therapist, as a family therapist, as a couples therapist. Because the core of what I just said was the people that find a way. Not find the way, like there's one path, right? Find a way, some path, find some path to feel a sense of agency in their life, that they are not capable in this moment of being a victim, right? That is different than having been victimized. Past perfect, right? So the goal is to stop living in the past when you are actively being victimized, to live in the present, which is a big part of ACT, humanistic therapy, CBT, psychodynamic, all types of therapy have this like, let's not live in the past, let's live in the present. You were assaulted in the past, in the present you're not being assaulted. You were in a terrible car accident in the past, you're not currently in a car accident, right? So when you do trauma therapy of any kind, cognitive processing therapy, prolonged exposure therapy, EMDR, whatever, all of it is to get people who are stuck in this past, living in the past and the present, so to speak, to just be living in the present and to tolerate the distress of the past in the present. So I'm not saying anything wild, I don't believe. However, when people walk around with victim mentality, when people on social media act as if they are currently being victimized, as if it's traumatic or tragic or something, when it's just a bunch of stupid tweets, be it humorous or mean or nasty or whatever, that falls into category level 1 of being victimized per Merriam-Webster. But is it the same thing as level 2? That's a subjective thing. But how useful is it when you have the capacity to just put the fucking phone down, let's say, and not just keep interacting on Twitter or something? Because at that point, you're choosing to fight. And if you're choosing to fight on Twitter for some reason, that's absurd. That's absolutely absurd. So what I'm trying to say is that there's a difference, number one, between being victimized and currently being a victim. Number two, there's a difference between having been victimized and victim mentality, right? So the first thing I said is there's a difference between being victimized, which means something tragic happened to you in the past, but it's not happening right now, versus number two, there's a difference between being victimized in the past versus victim mentality, which means you operate with an identity of being a victim, right? And that's not useful for anybody. There's no person I have ever seen, like I said earlier, I've worked with dozens of clinicians, supervised many people, I've consulted at many programs. I've been around long enough to see, with my convenient sample of a clinical career and personal life, I can't see a person whose life is better because they have this identity as a victim. That's bad. That's maladaptive. Now, that doesn't mean you didn't experience something horrific. That doesn't mean society sucks for you, right? So you can be part of an oppressed category of people, like you can be part of a racial minority that's oppressed in this country. You can be part of a sexual and gender minority, right? So I'm part of the queer community or whatever, And sometimes people say horrific shit to me. Mostly it doesn't happen. Thank God, right? And so most of the time, I don't experience people trying to insult me or demean me for my sexuality. Thankfully, it doesn't happen a whole lot. I'm lucky to live here in LA in that regard. In other ways, I'm not lucky to live here in LA. So there's a difference between your identity as victimized versus being a member of a group that's either traditionally, historically marginalized, right? Those are not the same thing. And when we see them as the same thing, then we become disempowered. And so what every person who loves you wants, I'm going to say this again extremely clearly, if somebody actually loves you, one more time, if somebody actually loves you, they want you to feel empowered. If somebody actually loves you, they want you to have self-agency. If somebody actually loves you, they want you to see yourself as whole, W-H-O-L-E, not broken. The people that talk to you online, the politicians, the activists, your friends and families, your neighbors, your colleagues who talk to you as if you are not whole, the people who talk to you as if you are less than because you're a member of a group of people do not love you. The people who love you and care about you want you to see yourself as empowered and capable. They want you to see yourself as having agency. They want you to see yourself as whole, not broken. So the people who love you want you to see yourself as whole. The people who love you want you to see yourself as capable. The people who love you want you to see yourself as not broken. Okay? Which is not some deep and profound thing, but unfortunately, people have created entire careers out of preaching to you that you are broken, that you are less than. And I'm here to tell you, I feel like I'm fucking preaching, but I'm here to tell you that none of you are broken. None of you are less than. All of you have power. All of you have agency. You may not have a lot because maybe you're in a very terrible circumstance. And so for that, I empathize to the extent that I can, and I understand, superficially at least, that you have less power than you deserve. However, thankfully in countries like the US, most people can gather, gain, work towards more and more power and more agency. That is the beauty of the modern world, is we actually have the capacity to become more and more empowered because we live in relatively free societies with lots of economic opportunity, right? And lots of social opportunity, thanks to social media and all these things. So you are not broken. You are whole. You currently have power. You currently have agency, okay? And that is why I believe that victim mentality is maladaptive, because victim mentality sends the opposite messages of those three things I just said. And as a human being, this is not even Patrick Lockwood, the professor or psychologist. This is just Patrick. So I want to have a chat with you all right now as just Patrick. This is just me, the person. You know, like me, Patrick, the person. If you met me at a coffee shop or at the gym, this is the person you would meet. I want to know what's awesome about you. If you met me at an event, at school, or whatever, I want to know what's awesome about you. I want to know what's great about your life. I want to know what you're capable of. I want to know the ways in which you are whole. I believe that there is a cool person inside everyone. Even the person that we think is the nastiest, ugliest person, there's got to be something good in there. There's got to be some, there's all sorts of disgusting people in politics, right? God, there must have been something good in there at some point, right? I'm an optimist. I believe that most people have the capacity to be whole and have agency and have power. And the reason I believe this, not only because of my professional life, where I've watched people who come from horrific backgrounds develop great lives, I've watched people climb out of poverty and homelessness and become CEOs. I've watched people overcoming life and death drug addictions where they've overdosed and died and become amazing people in recovery. I have seen the most awesome things in my life because of my career. And for that, I'm very grateful. I've watched people crawl out of the pit of hell, basically, metaphorically, and become awesome people. And so it's disgusting to me when people who live privileged lives talk down to the average public in media, when influencers on Twitter, political influencers, models, actors, people who have the most comfortable fucking lives, look at ordinary people and say, oh, you poor thing, you're never going to have a good life. Like, what fucking bullshit is that? If I can sit here and work in a toxic industry like the rehab industry and still people get healthy and live better lives and have power and overcome trauma and shame and addiction, some of the hardest things to overcome, and live good lives, how dare any of you talk down to people on Twitter or Instagram or on news shows or whatever? How dare any of you fucking have the nerve to say, you can never get better. Your life is so fucked, which is not true. If people with drug addictions and terrible PTSD and personality disorders and bipolar disorder who have real genuine obstacles to living the best possible life can live awesome lives, how dare you talk to ordinary people who don't have a serious mental illness or a life-threatening drug addiction and say, it can't get better. You're broken. You're permanently a victim. Like, how dare you? How fucking dare you? Because there's no way that's true. I have seen people overcome insane obstacles to live a better life. People who are maimed. People who are horrifically assaulted. Some of my best friends in this industry come from a background of terrible racism and trauma and pervasive neglect. And they live amazing lives. Some of my friends run major treatment centers, having come from terrible backgrounds. And it's just absurd to say, you are forever a victim. You have no agency. You have no power. So for me, what I believe, this is just Patrick. This is not me as a professional. This is just Patrick. I believe this. If people are talking to you and telling you you are not capable, you have no power, you are broken, then they don't love you. I'm going to say that one more time. My belief is any human being who talks to you and says, you have no power, you are not capable, you are broken, that person does not love you. Now, many people on the right and the left, they buy into this narrative that it's a status thing. Who's the biggest victim? Who's the most oppressed? All this shit. And that is toxic, which is why you should really be investing your time in people, places, and things that encourage you, that build you up, that show you how capable you are. So for me, that's how I feel. And I hope that's clear, because I can't imagine thinking the opposite. Because if you could see people come from terrible experiences and live great lives, and it happens in my career every month, someone gets a year sober, someone builds a business, someone gets married, someone has like a life-changing event that's in the most awesome possible direction, even though they come from tragic circumstances. So there's some comments here that I'm going to try to read. I don't know if I've walked right by them or what. Jonathan says, there are epistemological positions on the right and the left that encourage or predispose the individual to lose sight of personal agency. He says, Jonathan says, as a person on the right, extreme Calvinism is one. specifically the doctrine of predestination, that the future is already decided and sent by God. There's little room for agency there. Yeah, that's true. I think there's a lot of different interpretations of different religions that, people see their life as a foreclosed identity. It will never get better. It can't change. And I mean, I wouldn't be doing this work if I didn't think things could change, right? So, I want everyone who comes to therapy, everyone who goes to treatment or rehab, everyone who finds a couples counselor, everyone who goes to family therapy, whatever you're doing to improve your life by seeking a professional, I hope that whoever you're working with helps you feel empowered. If the professional you're working with is not relating to you in such a way that you feel empowered, I would be questioning, why is that? Right? Because the truth is, across most circumstances, most people with most types of trauma and mental illness and experiences of being victimized, there is a way to feel empowered. There is a way to have agency. There is a way to see yourself as not broken. I firmly believe that none of us are broken. It's so statistically rare that a person would have all the rare genetic variants of like high trait psychopathy and narcissism and stuff that their life is just screwed or something. Like, that's rare. Most of us, even despite adverse circumstances in childhood, personality differences, IQ differences, poverty, all these things, we can all have a better life. And I'm not a kumbaya person. You've heard my podcast before, hopefully, or you've seen me on Twitter. Like, I'm clearly not a kumbaya person. I'm also extremely optimistic. I cannot imagine a professional, a psychiatrist, a psychologist, an LCSW, an LPCC, LMFT. I cannot imagine anyone who loves you, anyone who cares about you, anyone who's ethical. I can't imagine an ethical professional who would talk to you in such a way that you would feel disempowered, like you have no agency, and that you're broken. That is absurd to me. As a clinical supervisor, I have never once given my supervisees feedback that they treat their patients as broken, having no power, or having no agency. That's not respectful. We all can have different amounts of power and different amounts of agency, right? So to go back to my buddy Nick Tabor from Twitter, one of the big challenges, one of the biggest challenges once you're in the mental health system is, if you're severely mentally ill, it is 100% true that if you're floridly psychotic, extremely aggressive, extremely suicidal, in a life-threatening way, the federal government, the state government, the local city government can take away your rights. And mental health professionals can be part of that. Theoretically, to save your life or the life of another person. Duty to warn, terrorists off, all those things. So it is true that in the mental health system, there are moments, there are times when the system will take away your power. There are times when the system will take away your agency. Now, in an ideal world, which does not exist, but in an ideal world, it would happen rarely. And it would only happen when there's a verifiable threat to self or other people. That's it. That's the ideal world. I do not know how often that happens in the wrong way, where it's used abusively. I don't know. I wish we had good data. Nick is right about that. We don't have good data on how many times the system abuses people. I'm sure it's not zero, and I'm sure it's not all the time. I'm sure it's somewhere between those two extremes. So I'm not here saying this kumbaya version of life, which is, you're so smart, you're so powerful, you're amazing, you're whole, you can do anything. I'm not that guy. What I'm saying is, I detest when people, especially professionals, talk to you in such a way that there's zero recognition of any power that you currently have, any agency that you currently have, and how whole you currently are. because the optimistic view is the correct one in my clinical experience. The pessimistic view is usually not the realistic view. And in no way does that excuse racism, poverty, trauma, oppression, or any of those things. I know plenty of people who experienced racism who developed a really good life, who became in power. I know people who experienced homophobia in my life who overcame and developed power and agency and lived amazing lives. I've worked with so many people, and I have so many friends across these oppressed groups that I see examples of people overcoming all the time. And not even in big ways, just living good lives in some situations. So the idea that a mental health professional will sit across from you and say, you do not have power, you do not have agency, and you are broken, is a problem. And I think that it's not okay for any professional to talk to you that way. Which is different than, I disagree. Which is different than, I think you're incorrect. Which is different than, you're wrong. Which is different. I mean, there's so many different variations of this conversation. When people disagree with you, that's usually a good thing. When people push back on you, that's usually a good thing. But if people are being cruel, that's a different story. If people are talking to you in such a way that you feel disempowered, that's a problem. So the question becomes, through what lenses am I seeing this conversation? Which is a big therapy conversation, because sometimes the therapist is unaware of the things they're saying that are wrong. Sometimes the therapist is projecting. Sometimes the therapist has their own countertransference they're not aware of. There's so many things that can happen, even with a smart and thoughtful therapist, where we don't treat people as equals. And that's a problem. So that's something I help my supervisees look out for when I supervise. And it's hard because power can be intoxicating for certain types. Certain people in the profession come from backgrounds of serious neglect. Certain people in the profession comes from backgrounds of serious shame. And so they want to overcompensate through power. And that's not okay. So as a supervisor and as a mentor, I try to help people not do that, right? And recognize where they have experiences of shame or trauma or neglect, where they want to overcompensate and they want to fix people. They want to heal people. They want to, make them better or something, which is not what we can do as professionals. It's impossible, right? So how do we empower people without trying to fix them like a broken Rolex, etc.? So I think that this little chat didn't really go precisely where I was thinking it would go. I sincerely thought I was going to spend, 20 to 30 minutes on that and then, talk about clinical psychology training and things like that. But I guess I'll do the what does training look like conversation next week, because I happen to be a professor in grad psych, at least for the time being, until I get canceled for this or whatever. But the thing that I want to kind of wrap this particular episode up with is it's really tough being a person in 2026. It really is. We live in, the most advanced time in history that we're aware of. We have the most access to technology, at least in the West. In industrialized countries, we have the most access to technology, wealth, food, water, all these things than ever in history. And yet so many people feel disenfranchised and disempowered, and they feel stuck, and many people feel broken. And, social media culture plays a role in that. Political culture plays a role in that. A lot of us get sucked into dynamics where we treat each other as adversaries. A lot of us get sucked into dynamics where we treat each other as better or worse. And I want everyone to understand that a lot of what I say on this podcast when I'm being critical of the profession does not mean that I am better than most people in the profession. I don't know. I don't have some subjective sense that I'm better or worse or something. That's not the framework that I want to operate from, and I try not to operate from. I genuinely hope that when professionals watch this podcast, when family members of loved ones in therapy or treatment watch this, when people in therapy or treatment watch this podcast, you hear me very clearly saying, I am just another guy who happens to be a professor and a clinician and a consultant and all this stuff, da 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 da. But in reality, I'm just a person. And so when I'm being critical of all these things like countertransference and victim mentality and shame leading to grandiosity or trauma leading to want to be empowered and empower, take charge of people's lives and all these things, I'm saying this because I've seen this in myself, and I've seen it in my interns, and I've seen it in my grad students, I've seen it in my colleagues, I've seen it in literally everybody. There is not one person in my professional life that I haven't seen these problems in. And one of the benefits for me, at least, of doing supervision with people is it reminds me to always be looking in the mirror, to be asking my friends for feedback, asking my significant other for feedback, asking, my colleagues for feedback. So the best thing that can come out of this podcast for hopefully most people is you get to see me as a regular person who happens to do these things professionally, and that I try to live the same way as what I'm preaching. And that is what is hard. What is hard is to actually recognize that what I'm saying is hard, right? It might sound easy to say something like check your privilege or check your bias or whatever it is. But the truth is to actually have a real, detailed, thoughtful awareness of why did I react that way? That is hard because it means being honest about something with yourself. And so every one of these podcasts is not just me criticizing the world and I am perfect. It's also a reminder to myself to be quite fully transparent with all of you. Because if I don't have reminders that I can hurt people, if I don't have reminders that I might miss something, I might have a countertransference moment that's about me, not about the patient, etc., then I won't be as good of a supervisor as I can be, or professor, or clinician on the rare occasion that I am a clinician, or consultant. Like, my life isn't going to be better if I hide behind I'm some moral authority. I am not a moral authority. I have strong beliefs and strong views, but that doesn't mean I am better than anybody. You know why? Because I have the same exact problems of everybody else in the profession. There is no version of me that is better than anybody else. I'm just here sounding the alarm about things that don't get talked about very regularly. And I see them. I have done them from time to time. Thankfully, I haven't broken any laws, thank God. But little things I've certainly done wrong, easily, many times in my career. And so this is partially just me making an amends and partially me reminding myself, but also trying to educate the public so that everyone can see what we all need to see. So we can all be aware that there are some therapists out there who have God complexes. There are some therapists out there who do want to talk to you as if you're broken, you have no power, and you have no agency. And those people are not there to help you. Those people are there for themselves. So we need to look out for those kinds of things and have conversations about them when we see them, right? So my sincere hope for everyone who watches this and everyone who listens to this is that you feel as empowered as possible. You see where you have agency. And if you are currently in therapy, if you're currently in a rehab somewhere, if you're currently doing family therapy or couples therapy or something like that, I sincerely hope that you see what kind of power you have, what kind of agency you have, and I sincerely hope that you see yourself as whole, not broken. Because everyone I know that sees themselves as whole and has found a way, to repeat the phrase from earlier, we find a way to be empowered, find a way to have agency. Those are the people that live the best possible lives, all things considered. And that's what I hope for everybody. And if you're in the profession and you see this as well, I'd love for you to comment or say something about this. I'd love for you to come at me on Twitter. Again, my handle on Twitter is at AlobhaPatrick, ALOBHAPATRICK. Come at me on Twitter. If you disagree with me, if you think I'm missing something, come at me. Leave a comment on YouTube. Come at me on Twitter. Because I'd rather this discussion continue than end. The worst thing in the world for me is when people agree with me. Because I like to fight, but I also want to figure out where I'm wrong. And so if I'm wrong, tell me. Let me know how I'm wrong. Let me know how I can do this better. So I really, really appreciate everyone who came out to watch and listen. There's been some comments. There's been a lot of people who've watched, which is awesome. So thank you all for being here. I hope that this was helpful, at least, if not stimulating. And I hope that, if you found this useful in some way or challenging, that you share it with other people. Because my genuine belief is if we share ideas that challenge us or that help us, then it'll probably help somebody else. So please like and share. And if you feel like it, subscribe. That would be awesome. And get the word out because I want to help as many people as possible by just sharing my critique of the industry. So this is not advice directed at any particular person. I'm not here acting as your professor, your therapist, whatever. This is just me speaking as generally as possible. So I hope this has made sense. I hope it's been helpful at some point. And I look forward to doing this again next week. I'll talk about clinical training and all sorts of stuff. Please take good care of yourselves. No joke today. This is a very serious podcast, so I don't want to, do it injustice by trying to joke around. I'll see you all next week. Have a good Saturday. Again, take good care. Eat good food. Have good sex. Have good fun. Sleep well. And